All right. So I'd like to welcome everybody today to our First Responder Friday, and I am super excited about this and have been for quite a bit. But we have a really cool topic today that we're going to talk about. And I want to do an introduction first for our presenter today. This is Janet Werner. Janet is the president of A.W.A.R.E LLC, and I want to give you just a brief background about Janet. So not only is she the president of You Have My Word, but she has served in corporate America since 1988 as a change management consultant, a trainer, and executive coach. She is also the executive director of a docuseries and feature movie in development that focuses on the spiritual side of mental health. Now, Janet leads the New Jersey A.W.A.R.E, which is a coalition of religious, spiritual, and mental health leaders who are on a mission to improve mental health systems in New Jersey through religious and spiritual leaders in the standard of care for mental health. And I want to, without further ado, welcome Janet to our First Responder Friday, and I'm going to let her go ahead and take the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you. What a privilege. Olivia, as you know, this is the first time we're doing this to bring a lot of years and years and years of research together and bringing it together to first responders. So I'm going to invite everybody to just think about the question throughout the entire hour. Are we aware of religious and spiritual experiences in mental health? That's it. All we want to do is, are we aware? Are you aware before you got here? Are we more aware once we're in this and after? There's so much training and education that can happen, not going to happen in this session. It's really going to be a raise of awareness. And probably similar to how we started over a year ago, Olivia. We just started raising awareness. So I actually want to start off with naming names, and they're just first names. But I have studied hundreds of stories of people who have had spiritual, religious, and/or mental health crisis. I've read stories, I've met them. So I just want to sit back and think about if you've met any of these people in your own life who have had a spiritual experience, a religious experience, but got caught up in the mental health system, got locked up behind locked doors, forced on meds, and stigmatized, had a prejudice against them within their family, friends, work community, but they really were having some kind of a spiritual awakening. So I named Mary, Jen, Maisha, Kalechi, Emily, Peggy, Brett, Marlena, Colleen, Denise, Sean, Gogo, Jim, Sarah, Matt, Mark, Lucy, Carolyn, Laura, Jenny, Stacy, Joshua, Jen, Manpreet, Benjamin, Oryx, Vesper, David. Unnamed is someone's dad. Another unnamed is someone's son. Then there's another dad. And then there's my son's mom. So my name got added to that list in 2005 when I had what was really a good spiritual awakening that was seen as a mental illness. I got escorted by the police into a mental institution, fully sane, fully calm. And after the police met me and looked at my research on this topic, they said to me, but we have to take you in anyway. And I almost felt bad for them because I don't think they wanted to. So I start that way because I am so inspired and motivated, not really from my own story. I'm so way past it. I'm an advocate for the many people around the world that I met in all cultures, across many religions, agnostics and atheists who have had a spiritual experience. And in some cultures, they were honored. Depends on the indigenous group they came up with, the religious orientation. In many places in the United States, it's not honored. And what we're looking to do is raise the awareness. So are we aware of religious and spiritual experiences in mental health crisis? That's the question. The people I named are all currently medical doctors, PhD researchers or therapists. They're teachers. They're professionals in our business organizations. They're lawyers as well here. I don't have any law enforcement people on my list yet. But these are all people that went through the mental health system, were misunderstood. And it's almost like the mental health situation escalated because they were not understood. And I'm going to call on Dr. Olivia in a little bit to comment on some of the simple things we can do. But these people were told they never amount to anything. They should reach for lower goals. Don't go for a PhD degree. You're going to be mentally ill for the rest of your life. You're going to have to be on medicine for the rest of your life. I would say 90, if not 100% of them are not on meds and are contributing members of society. And most of them can tell you of a spiritual experience they had that was just misunderstood. So on an economic point, we don't want to spend money on locking these people up. On a humanistic point, we want to save the shame that happens and the human suffering when you have a really good, beautiful, simple spiritual awakening. Sometimes it's not so simple, that we want to just be aware when we start to see religiosity, spiritual language come out. So I'm going to go back to a few conversations I had over a year ago. Ernie Stevens, some of you might be familiar, retired police officer from Texas. He's in his own HBO movie, Ernie and Joe Crisis Cops. And I shared my story with him when I first met him, and I was a little scared, like, is he going to think of me different? But what happened is two things. Ernie said to me immediately that 30 to 40% of the crisis calls he was going out on in Texas had some kind of a spiritual or religious tone to it. And I'm like, oh, so you know what I'm talking about. And he said that we use the term in the law enforcement arena that it's hyper religiosity. So that was a new term for me. I'm like, all right, let's look at that name. There's a word called hyper religiosity. Someone's having a crisis. They might be writing Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad or something on their walls, and it looks a little crazy. Ernie happens to be a very empathetic, compassionate person, and you can watch his movie to hear how he handles it. But that was kind of my first introduction to law enforcement and someone of a compassionate nature, saying we see this, but we're not really aware of it, that it exists. Other language and conversations I picked up was religious fanaticism. All right, so then that looks like a very intense religious experience. Sometimes it really looks like a mental illness scenario. Sometimes it's combined with a pretty high mental challenge. Sometimes it's a pure, simple religious or spiritual experience. I just want you to think about, in your own scenario, whether you were a professional helping or if you've had it, in your own family, friends, or self, to what extent are you even aware of that people have spiritual experiences, right? We have them. The research says at least 50% of Americans have a mystical or spiritual experience. You can look it up. We can, send it out later, but that's a research fact. Ernie Stevens was telling me that he actually saw 30 to 40% is actually showing up on the mental health call. So there's some, background for this. In 2005, June 17th, I was on Wall Street in New York, presenting to financial investors to get money to train medical doctors, therapists, and the entire mental health community to be aware, almost what we're doing now, just to be aware that this spiritual experience exists and it's not all mental illness and it does not all need to be medicated and put it in the hospital. And it was a pretty exciting experience for me, June 17th, 2005. Now, guess what happened? 9 days later, I was locked up in a mental institution. I had a peach suit with high heels presenting on Wall Street in front of 90% black or gray suits, mostly men, one woman in the audience, and they were astonished to raise the awareness. And I don't know if you can see it, but I know you know of it. This is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And this one is from 1994. So I brought it and I showed them and I said, do you know, are you aware that there's a piece way back in the back that talks about spiritual and religious problems? Like it exists, it's actually sitting in there. And that most medical schools don't train on it. Most first responders don't know about it. Most family members and whoever, they're just not aware. But since 1994, there's been an ethical mandate to care for people from a spiritual perspective across all cultures. We're now 20 years later, and more of that is happening. There's more of a cultural awareness that people come from different frames of reference. The spiritual part is kind of peaking out, just kind of getting going. How did I wind up on a psychiatric ward 9 days after a Wall Street presentation where I was empowered, finally doing some work advocacy? And I'll keep it simple. I had known about this for some 25 years before. I kind of kept it quiet. And when I got out on Wall Street, I really got pretty excited that I was now on a new mission to try to improve the mental health system. And the person that I told it to was not open, immediately reacted, and thought I was either on drugs, which I've never taken drugs in my life, and thought I was in somewhat of a manic episode, of which I wasn't. I was in a heightened episode, excited from Wall Street. So the short version is, instead of sitting and talking with me, 911 was called. We didn't have 988 then. And police officers showed up at this particular home, looked at all my research, because that was pretty much what I was trying to share. Just went on Wall Street. Here's my research. I need to expose this. And the short end, as I said before, the officer said, well, we have to take you in anyway. And I said, all right, let it be known I'm going in involuntarily, but I'm complying. Now, here's the short end of that story before I ask Dr. A.W.A.R.E if he's experienced any of this in his work. When I got on the hospital, and well, actually, I'll say when I looked at my medical report later of what was written down for me, guess what they said? Delusions of grandeur, think she's connected to Wall Street. And Olivia, you can laugh because I know that's your favorite part. I was telling the truth. And if someone is automatically seen as having a mental illness or a mental health concern and not understood to just be aware, oh, she's actually telling the truth, she's having a spiritual experience, etc. The absolute fact of I was on Wall Street trying to prevent this was written as I had delusions, and could have been fact checked, but we'll leave that. So let's just say I firsthand experienced what it's like to have a prejudice, to have lack of awareness, and the stigma and the suffering that happens. So we want to prevent that with the beginnings of awareness. I'll come back a little bit to the DSM-4. There's also in the DSM-5 that says religious and spiritual experiences truly exist, and it should be part of the therapeutic practice and support. So Dr. Jory, could you just give a kind of a brief comment of your awareness that this is true in your profession?
Yeah, let me you have a lot there, and let me kind of try to shrink it down. And I'm looking at it from, I'm also a police officer, I'm a retired chief of police, also a psychologist. I was in private practice, still do a lot of consultant work, but several things. People, I always try to expand the concept of that religious spirituality. Basically, it's a belief system, and all of us have one. And when I train police officers, I always tell them, I make them aware that you always have a belief system, and you try to identify that in people. What do they believe? What don't they believe? How they believe is getting more in depth, but you want to understand what they believe and what they don't believe. And you can encounter that on a lot of calls. Okay. And that's where a lot of police officers do, I'll say, like kind of overreact and just they'll arrest somebody, they'll take them to the hospital. And that comes from not knowing, just like you say, awareness. And over my 50 years in law enforcement, I've seen our profession become more aware, and we're really in the stages now of being aware of a lot of things that we weren't aware of. I tell people, I remember in Florida when wives were chattel, they were property. A man could beat his wife up, my officers respond, and the husband could say, "Get off my property," and we had to leave. Okay. And I see through the awareness, we've changed that, but it's taken us 20, 30 years to do that. The same way I've seen with mental health issues. And we're making them more aware of it. In fact, we have, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, that's what certifies officers. And we have mandatory training that we have to go through every 4 years, 2 years, things like that. And I just went through some, and they have a 4-hour mental health awareness. And I could see that this fits into that. So we're making,
Yes.
officers aware. We're making them aware on the patrol level, but we need to make the administrators aware of it also, because I've seen officers, they get on a call and their answer to everything is arrest them.
Mm.
And a lot of times officers are left with no option but to arrest them or take a person to the hospital. Because, here in Florida and across the country, we have certain criteria and laws, like we have Marchman, we have a Baker Act, and there's certain criteria. And I find it here in Florida that there's only 3 people that can commit under a civil commitment somebody to a hospital, and that's a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a police officer. And here in Florida, to be a police officer, you need a 9th grade level of education, versus the 20 some years of education I have in my experience, and my partner who's a psychiatrist, but again, that's when they get on the scene, they're dealing with it the best they can. And sometimes that's the simple way of just taking them to the hospital and letting somebody like me or a psychiatrist then deal with them and evaluate them. I have seen, again, people that have religious experience. I recognized it as such. I discussed with it, but I would still, evaluate them. Do they mean harm to themselves or to others?
Mhm.
If not, then, they're free to go. They're released. But I really applaud the efforts of making this awareness push at all levels, not only police, but the EMTs,
Yes.
because like I say, I have had experiences, and some of them are kind of comical, but nonetheless, they resulted in somebody going to the hospital under a Baker or a Marchman Act.
Yes.
So
We're,
I hope that
we're
kind
gonna
of
be,
explains, you know, the
that's very
perspective.
helpful. And I want to make sure, towards the end, we're going to actually talk about what are the simple things that we're advocating, a police officer, an EMT, family members. What are some of the simple things that can be done to prevent going down the wrong path? So we'll do that. I see Sean is saying it seems like society has accepted the fact that we help out with the mentally ill, either through the emergency rooms or jail, which is really sad. Yes. So Sean, again, towards the end, I'm going to start to talk about in New Jersey, part of the coalition that we started last year is to include clergy into the calls. Give a lived experience person the right to call in their clergy or spiritual leader, either at the scene or if they have to actually go into an incarcerated situation, which an emergency room is to me. So please keep putting your thoughts and questions into here. So we're keeping the question, are we aware of religious and spiritual experiences? So as we're aware, we don't have to immediately judge that this is a nutcase, a person's, has to be brought right into an ER. There's a stop and a pause, especially obviously if safety is already handled, there's no danger of self or other. What did Ernie Stevens observe, writing on the walls? How did he interpret that? How did he sit down and say, talk to me a little bit? How did he embrace the family who was panicked over what could be called bizarre behavior? And how could it be de-escalated? So I'm gonna bring Dr. Olivia in. Olivia's been on some of our events, our live virtual events. We were introducing what is 988 in general, but then what is 988 when we involve clergy? So we had various clergy from different religions, and there were some common themes that were offered. And Olivia, I love some of the words that you used to begin to de-escalate, to have a human response in those moments. So would you also brief us on some of those key words that also the clergy used?
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked a lot about empathy, compassion, and just listening. And with a huge piece of that being empathy, I think a lot of the times that, the police get called to begin with, or we immediately want to take somebody to an ER and get them checked in, is because there's a fear of the unknown. And that's the whole point around this awareness, is we want to make people aware of this. Now, we're not asking cops, of course, to make determinations about mental health issues or diagnosis. That's not it. They have enough jobs. And we've talked about that at length as well. But the idea that once the scene is safe and we have first responders on scene, taking that little bit of time to show empathy, that this is someone's family member, that, this could be a coworker. These are people in your community. And at that moment, they're in their probably probably the worst day of their lives in that moment, because they're being misunderstood and they're not able to express themselves. And I think it's really important that we step back for a moment and realize that in that moment, as long as things are safe for the officer and everybody else on scene, that we need to start showing more empathy as people. This is going to change the whole trajectory of this individual's life. It's going to help de-escalate the scene. When you start questioning, and telling them that what they're saying isn't true or it's not reality, we're heightening that emotion, and then, which is not what we need to do. Whether we believe it or not is not really the key here. It's allowing them to be in their reality for that moment, to de-escalate the scene. And you will also change when they go to get treatment or they go to see somebody, they're going to be more open, that they're not being judged about everything they say or do. I've dealt with this quite a few times, but one of the times that I remember, I was a church security director, and I had a young man come into into the church, and he was leaving notes and different things, and it was spiritual in nature, but he was referring to himself as he was God and he was going to take over our church. And you could tell that the reality wasn't there in that case, and he had mental health issues. But who am I to say that that's not his reality, right? So, it's taking that step to be empathetic, making sure that he has the resources available, and not jumping to conclusions that he's immediately dangerous or going to hurt himself or someone else. And I think that's what we do when that fear piece comes in, is we're afraid of liability. We're afraid of mishandling it. And I think when we can educate people to what some of these things are, we can reduce that fear and in turn make better decisions in the future.
And can I add something in there, Janet?
Yes, yes.
Um, you know, I'm a stat guy, and your statistics, and I agree with them. Okay, they're 30-50%. And let me kind of clarify that. When we talk about religious, spiritual experiences, not all of them are negative. The
Right.
majority, I would say, are going to be positive. I had a fellow psychologist I went to graduate school with. I really trusted her. She had great experience medically and everything, life experience. And she made the comment one time. She said about spirituality and belief. She said, "Have you ever had an experience or a blessing that was so powerful and personal that you couldn't share it?"
Mm.
And a lot of times people do have that, and that comes out in, maybe it might be confusion. It can come out in different behaviors. It might come out in what we would observe as being disconnected, even maybe anxious, depressed, something, hyperactivity, all of these things, kind of like what you described in your personal experience. But, we see this and we quickly kind of assign some kind of these mental health behavioral aspects to it. And, again, all of those that I think that have been, that are here, have heard us talk about, the disease model. The medical profession, the mental health is always geared towards a disease model. These are the things that make you, sick, make you mentally unstable, instead of what we really kind of promote is the health model. Here's the positives, so, when you looked at that high percentage, I really wanted to clarify that because I agree with it. And from my own research, I've seen it, but a lot of it is from that positive too, that
Yes.
still we need to make them aware of, because they're going to encounter that and they need to be, at least in a position to move that on to the medical staff, like if they do have to hospitalize them. I always like to get the police report, and at least the police in my area, they do behavioral observations, very descriptive, because again, we've trained them to be that way. So making them aware of not only the negatives, but the positive aspects of this.
Absolutely. And I want to cover 2 points. It's a great next step for me. You might wonder, why would the person that I will keep unnamed call the police on me when I was not in harm to self or others? I really wasn't acting out. I was in a heightened state of real excitement from Wall Street. Having held my story in for 25 years, I wanted the person to know, look, you didn't know what really happened 25 years ago. Let me tell you the truth. And I spread out all my research in front of the person. And it looked maybe a little nuts, but it was still orderly. What did I hold in? And Dr. Jury, you said it. At 25 years old, I was in my master's degree for counseling. And I had a nice, good, positive spiritual awakening, which does happen in the 20s a lot. There's probably statistics there too. I never had it before. Again, I had a Christian experience, but having grown up in, a church setting, I never heard of this thing that happened to me. So I'm like, all of a sudden, I'm highly enlightened, felt like I had a Holy Spirit encounter, but I knew no one to explain it to. And I'm 25, and I do have a Christian family. So the fact that I held it in caused it to escalate. It caused it to escalate into a little fear. People are going to think I'm nuts, that I had an experience of, Christ. So I'm like, okay, let me keep this quiet. I'm sure God's going to handle this. And I'll just keep it simple, that I was observed to be in hyper energy at 25. And so again, the college did their due diligence and moved in on me and said, I have to go into a hospital. All right, went into a hospital for 2 weeks at 25 and was diagnosed as manic depressive, of which I could not convince them I had a beautiful spiritual experience. So mine was like, it was a good thing that I just had to walk through because the medical staff or my college just could not understand. I'm going to
You
take
see
that and then say, what's that?
oh, you see that manic bipolar episode that you were labeled with?
Yes,
That in that age group that you're at, the prevalence of that developing is usually 18 to 28. So, I
yeah,
mean, you would be a textbook diagnosis under that DSM-4 and even the 5.
yes,
Okay. And yet, think about this, that under their own statistics, that's only about maybe 3 to 5% of the total population that had a bipolar manic episode versus 30 to 50% of people that have, positive spiritual religious experiences. So again,
yes,
that just fits right back into that kind of disease model. Let's put her on a mood stabilizer. We'll give her this for sleep and boom, we're going to
yes,
medicate.
yes. And, I'm seeing a comment, masking for years could be harmful. Yes. But in many ways, I really was guided by my belief in God, and I was off meds. I was not near the mental health system. I'm very, very successful in business. So I don't know, in my mind, I proved, I had a spiritual experience and God just walked me through it. It's that the fact that I had that label and the person that I spoke out to 25 years later kept that label. And so one thing that's finally happening in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, 15, there's more exposure coming out on let's not diagnose so quickly. Let's look at the real truth and research about chemical imbalance. Everybody's not chemically imbalanced, and definitely meds are not always the answer, and sometimes, many times, can harm. So I want to lean into a recent event. If you're familiar with Rutgers University, it's a state university in New Jersey. A number of my team went to the medical school conference where psychiatrists and other experts presented. And they presented exactly what we're talking about. The medical students were presenting their research about what is psychosis, what is a spiritual experience or a spiritual crisis. I was so excited to see it because it was coming out of the medical school, starting to say, wait a minute, are we aware that some of this might be a spiritual experience? But here was one of the points. One of the presenters, who was a medical doctor, said, before we diagnose so quickly, call the clergy. This doctor actually said that before we diagnose so quickly, call the clergy. And we were almost jumping out of our seats. So that was a great point, and I'm going to keep promoting that statement. What my team did after that is we started a coalition. Actually, that day, we brought clergy from various religions, therapists, trained doctors, and we brought them into a room. I could make the video accessible to you. And we started a monthly conversation between clergy, medical, therapists, and lived experience to start saying, well, how do we do this thing that this presenter just said, called the clergy? Fast forward to now, we must have had 10, 15 meetings. One thing that came out is clergy are not familiar with the spiritual experience if it's outside the church or the synagogue or the mosque. Or so that's not a blanket statement, but a lot of clergy said, we can't do that. We're not trained enough in all of the nuances of the mental psychosis, spiritual experience of an extreme nature. So what we found is that clergy across different disciplines also want to be educated, but together. So I wanted to make that statement that it was great that this conference brought it out, but then if you call clergy might not be so comfortable to handle it. So part of our steps to even help and support first responders is to educate clergy across disciplines that this exists. And if you encounter it outside your house of worship, how do we involve you? And some of the clergy had mentioned One, we would just like to walk alongside the first responder. And Olivia, you might even comment on this. Some of the clergy said we can just help calm the situation down, even if we don't understand it, but allow us to walk with you. And then if a person's brought into a psych hospital, allow us to be a part of it. So at least we can help calm the family, the individual, to know that there is a system other than medication or law enforcement bringing them in. So Olivia, did you want remember, one of your points you made back a little while ago about the value of a clergy showing up, if that was like a norm, and the value of that?
Well, it's not a norm in most cases. And we did talk about that. And we talked about the fact that it may be difficult to get them on scene because they may not want to come or be involved. And I think a lot of that has to do with they're just not educated in that area, number one. But I think it's definitely a resource that we should at least have available. Many agencies have, spiritual leaders and from different, backgrounds that come to different events. I think making them aware, at least on a minimal level, may help bridge that gap within, the work being done by patrol officers, EMTs, those going on scene, to the people in your community. And at least making it aware that maybe someone can share when they pass off an individual to the ER or wherever they're going, that maybe they have a spiritual leader that they would love to have contacted. And maybe it's just as simple as that. Just like you're sharing information that this could be a possible religious experience. I'm not making, any diagnosis of anybody, but this is what's being said, sharing the police report with people like A.W.A.R.E and clinical personnel, but passing along that this individual has mentioned a spiritual leader in their life that they would like to have called, and maybe, make sure that that's happening, and letting them know that they're going to do that. That helps de-escalate the scene as well, because you do believe them in that moment. You're telling them that you believe what's happening to them is real, whether it is or not, physically doesn't matter. Again, you're just reassuring them that you're listening to them, you're showing them empathy, and what's it going to hurt to try to call this individual?
Exactly. And I'm gonna go ahead.
It comes back, Janet, to like making them aware, and usually specifically in your regions, I have found, the cultures vary. I know in the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque Medical Center, on staff is a Navajo shaman. Okay. I had one of my doctor buddies interned there and said, he would come in and he made rounds, he staffed, but he was a recognized Navajo shaman. He was their religious leader, and that's the culture in that area. And I think, I know in my area, we're making our clergy aware. We have a very active chaplaincy program for law enforcement. I started it when I was chief of police 30 some years ago, and it's still very active. And our officers, really rely on it when they get into a situation, that they not only your experience, like say, with the spiritual experience, but say in the grieving process and death and stuff like that. So again, it's making people very much aware of it at all levels of the profession and education. And like I say, this 30 to 50% experience research, that's high. So there's a lot more going on out there than we really understand and see or recognize it as such.
Yes. And again, I keep wanting to use that aware. Are we aware of religious experiences? Because as we start making the awareness, then there's more opportunity for conversation. There's more opportunity to stop and pause and say, wait a minute, how am I judging this situation? And that might be a family member, a friend, a work situation, or an actual emergency call. That if we can just stop for a moment, wait a minute, what else is happening here? And then if there's a crisis response team, a support, a therapeutic community, that group we would want to be aware. And I think there is more education happening there, where someone that has a little more time than the first responder, where, oh, we can have a little conversation. Oh, are we aware that in the DSM, in this statistical manual, this is not necessarily bipolar or schizophrenia, not necessarily. I'm hearing some religious concerns coming out. There was a statement here 30 years ago, stoic attitudes were the treatment for mental health. You know, there was really no room for trying to understand, did you just go through a divorce? Did you just have a crisis in your life? You know, even at a very subtle level, that's a spiritual experience of grieving or, you know, trauma. Trauma-informed therapy also calls for, you know, stop and pause and let's check, because we might be able to de-escalate this and save the stigma and the pain of taking months or years later to get that clarity. I remember there was someone at my college campus in 1979 before I was told to go in a psychiatric ward when I was, again, totally sane. And the gentleman, Renee, said, don't do this to her. It'll haunt her the rest of her life. I remember that voice. And what we might want to do is just stop and pause and be a voice, you know, in those scenarios where there's no harm to self or others. There's almost, you know, obvious misunderstanding by friends or family, whoever called the first responder in. And one of the questions we would love first responders to be able to say, are you aware? Are we aware of a religious or spiritual experience? Do we know that it's actually in the DSM? So even at that site, and again, Olivia, I don't know if you want to comment, because you and I spoke to, there's 2 points or 2 times we believe first responders can speak up. As long as, again, no danger to self and other. One is at the family or friend scenario time of, are we aware that this is actually a real experience, not to be shut down? Did you want to comment on, is that realistic for a first responder to raise that question?
Well, I think I brought early on that, you know, cops and first responders in general have a big job already, and they're already being asked to do a lot. So I think that that's important. But I also think that when they do the reports, they're going to note this kind of stuff because they're going to try to make a case. They're going to try to make sense of the situation. So I think the awareness piece of this isn't so much that it's in the DSM for them. It's going to be that it's the aware piece, that they don't have to know anymore. They just have to know what's being said in the context of it and just pass it along to medical professionals to make note in their chart, or just make note when they see the next person or a clinician. So when they get to the point of seeing somebody like A.W.A.R.E or another professional, it's noted somewhere. So at least somebody takes a look at it. You know, we're not asking anybody to make a diagnosis or a determination. That's not our jobs. We're not qualified to do that. But we can make those cases because we would share that information with other professionals when they got on scene. So why not with the professionals that they're going to see at the end?
Exactly. And that would have made a difference for me in 2005, that the officers were aware. You know, they really, it seemed like they didn't know why they were called, because, you know, the whole scene was calm and I was interacting with them pretty much like I am now. And they felt apologetic, like, we have to take you in anyway. At that time in New Jersey, you know, if somebody calls a wellness check, I guess they had to follow through on it. So that would be a perfect moment of, you know, family, friends, whoever's here, are you aware? One, that she just went to Wall Street, speaking on the spiritual experience, and she's trying to explain she's having a spiritual experience. Doesn't sound like a mental health crisis right now, right? So we did say perhaps at that first response site, that question can be asked, especially if you see or hear religious language, right? The second time, and I love that you say that first responders do need to file a report, they can put statements in. That second point is, and I'd love to hear from the audience here, you know, what would it be like if a first responder who we believe wants to help, you know, first responders are not looking to just lock people up, they want to help. So if there's an awareness and they have to bring someone to an ER, let's just say I'm being escorted. If that first responder said to the ER, are you aware that there is a religious spiritual experience? And this woman is saying it. And that has to be written down, I assume. That did not wind up on my medical report. What often is in a medical report when there's no first responder, family, or friend, this is like a standard. And Dr. Jury, you can just kind of comment like that if it's true. most of the names I read off, again, they're all professionals. The moment they brought up the term God on the ER, it was written in as delusions, out of touch with reality. As soon as that term God is brought up, and again, these people have done PhDs in research way after they got out, and they quote that. They said, that's in my medical report. And it's because there's no awareness. So I think my question is, or comment is, how realistic is it for a first responder to even say that if they have to drop somebody off at an ER?
If you
Richard,
look in the
I'm kind of-
DSM 4 or 5, there's a lot of references to God, spirits, these type of things, and they're usually aligned with, the psychosis, which is simply loss of touch with reality. So again, that goes back to that disease model. What makes you ill, not what keeps you healthy. I've encountered, when I made rounds, especially in the behavioral health unit, and saw patients that were brought in with, under a Baker or Marchman Act for mental evaluation, and they would bring up God. I mean, again, I recognize it as a belief system, and I talk openly about it. I evaluate it. I listen to it. I don't automatically go to the psychosis aspects of the DSM-5. And again, that has a lot to do with my region, knowing my area where I'm at in Florida, knowing the majority of my people. Now, there's some cities, if I were practicing in some cities in this country, that, if a person was brought in and relating God and different types of things, kind of like what Olivia was talking about, the story where the person was putting out notes and stuff, then I may look a little different at it, because again, you've got different cultures. Fortunately, when I was in private practice, my partner, the psychiatrist, is a Muslim, and so we kind of really covered all bases when it comes to belief systems, but again, we didn't automatically go to a psychosis or a delusional anything. We evaluated it. And so police officers, again, they're looking at, well, if they bring up this name, is it in a sense where it means harm to them or others? Because they're always looking at the potential for harm. If somebody's having just a religious experience, talking to God or talking about God, and there's nothing to be considered, harmful outcomes. I know in my area, officers would just go, okay, 10-4, make a report and go on.
Yes, Richard. Does he need help being unmuted?
Rich,
Do we
can you
have a
type it
mask?
in? Yeah, type it in the chat and I'll get them to unmute us here.
Oh,
There we go.
There you go, Rich.
okay. I really love what you're doing, Janet. I think it's got a lot of value. And, obviously I've made a few comments there. When you seen the comment there about the 7th floor elevator door opening, unfortunately, that's a reference to department policies. Those department policies are laid in with vicarious liability. It's stacked in there, and it's going to ring through it. And unfortunately for the first responders, they're going to have to make that decision. And at the end of the day, they're looking at, if I leave this person here, whether it's spiritual or not, are they going to harm themselves or somewhere else? And I can promise you, I was in law enforcement for 17 years, and there's a lieutenant, there's a captain, there's a major, there's all these other guys when they read that report the next day, because no doubt somebody wants to read it and go do the, oh my God, Odom did so-and-so last night, right? And they turn it into this huge thing. I think that the training has to be there. I think that it has to be put in their policies. What I said about scenario training, it can't just be simple, right? I'm sure there's a few other cops in here besides me. And we all know when we do scenario training, it doesn't always go the way it needs to be because we're playing, we're not training, right? So even the actors in that scenario, they need to be taught how this person may act in that spiritual awakening, right? So that they can learn to define it, and they have to understand this isn't the place for humor, right? We gotta train how we're gonna play. And it has to be from step one to step two. I love what you're doing. I see tons of use in it. And I
Okay.
wish you and pray all the best for you in your plight there. I think that once you can get some of these upper echelon leaders to really open their eyes and understand being stoic is no way to, I can tell you 120% without a doubt, that stoic attitude is what killed my career, right?
Mm, mm,
Not just from me, but also from my leadership.
mhm,
So I would encourage you to keep chipping away at that block
mm.
every day. You've got a
Thank
plan.
you. Thank you. I'm watching the time here. I'm going to make a comment and then see how you want to wrap up. Thank you so much for that. We are creating a docu-series, not just a documentary, because it's going to take a while to, really educate. We're doing it for the mainstream. And it's not even necessarily training. It's all about awareness and the impact of not being aware. So stay tuned. We'll show you where that is. But I'm gonna close with how we opened. All we wanted to do today is go one more step on awareness, because there's a lot to do with training and de-escalation and scenario practice, which is beyond the scope of this. And let's see how much we can influence that down the road. But and let's just say, as a protective or a safety measure, you just got to bring the people into the ER. Oh, well, okay. But can you say something that we heard the person talking about Jesus and Buddha and, or just Jesus or whatever? Can you say that, and that you're aware that there's something valid about that? Like if you can just say that, because you're not diagnosing and you're not stopping them from going into an ER. That's what I had to look at what's reasonable that can happen that could at least make the process more healing or understood. Like if I was validated by you, Richard, that was said to me, I would have had an easier time when they keep me for 2 weeks. Especially since I brought it up to the medical profession and they just looked at me, clinical gaze, don't say anything. Anyway, that would be just the one thing we wanted to raise today. Are we aware, and can we make a statement either in front of the family, friends, or at the ER, and then it gets in the medical report? The person has a little more chance to get attention. Olivia, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, actually, Leo would like to share something real quick before
Oh.
we end here, Janet, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And as he's getting ready, I'm seeing interpersonal communication skills are needed. That's it. And it starts with listening, observing, empathy, compassion. So thank you for that, Richard. Where's Leo?
There he
Thank
is.
you, thank you. Honored to meet you, ma'am. January 25th, 2019 was a very, very bad day for me. And I went to a church and I sat there for a couple hours and I didn't get the answers that I wanted or I needed. And I got a bottle of Jack and I made a plan and I went back to my room and I bought a sandwich. God said to me, you better eat the sandwich, man. The sandwich saved my life. That's spiritual. To me, that's spiritual, and
Yes.
In the DSM, where is spirituality? Because God has a plan. I'm doing a presentation next month for police chaplains. And I'd like to quote that if I can find it. So if it's in the DSM or whatever, if you could send it to Olivia, that would be great. I would appreciate that very much. Thank you very much. And as for
I can get you something on it too, Leo. I'll get you something on it.
Thank you, Dr. Jury. And as for a padded cell, I got 372 hours and a 10-day myself. It's nice to meet you, man.
Let's keep talking.
That's good.
Let's
That's
keep
good.
talking.
Thanks for
I'm glad
sharing,
you heard the
Leo.
guidance. You know, you did hear the guidance. And I think at the beginning of the chat, we did put something, I think we put the link for DSM V code. It's a V code. It's hidden in the back of the DSM. And literally, if you just look up DSM V code, spiritual and religious problems, you will find content. Yep.
Yeah.
1994, it's been around. It is in the 1995, it's in the V code. It's in the 5th edition as of 2013. So thank you.
Guys, if you go up in the chat too, Janet has some more contact information up there. If you need anything when we're done here, I can send that to you. And there is a link if you need to get a certificate of completion for today's webinar. Janet, I am so honored to have you on here. I think that it's a movement for sure. And it's opening up the, just our minds to different possibilities. And I think once we have information, like Maya Angelou said, once we know better, we have to do better. And I think we're on that trail. And Dr. Jory, thank you for your expertise as always. Guys, if you have any comments, questions, or need anything afterwards, do not hesitate to reach out to us.
David, if I could I comment out? I see definitely a movement. I want to just say this one practical thing, and Olivia, we're always in contact. So if we can offer like next steps and information after. The New Jersey Coalition for Spiritual, Religious, and Mental Health Leaders is a beginning in New Jersey. We are now including law enforcement and all first responders. So we are meeting physically in New Jersey. So I'm saying, all right, let's get this moving. But then I want to put out there, let's do it in every state or another state, because it's just a group of people talking together. It is an unofficial group of getting us in the same room to do what we do here. Also, we'll close with, I did go on a psychiatric ward 2 weeks ago, escorted by a clergy. And it's the first time I've been back. It was wonderful because this particular hospital system pays clergy to go on the psychiatric ward, which historically they're kept away. They go to oncology, maternity, et cetera, but they don't go near the psychiatric ward. So we're actually breaking through in 3 or 4 hospitals in New Jersey, hopefully more, where clergy do go on that psychiatric ward and add the spiritual component. So wanted to end with those 2 steps that things are moving. Yes.
Wonderful. And let me see, make sure we don't have any more comments. I reposted all the stuff for Janet's links there. I think that's it, guys. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to Janet directly, or Dr. Jory or myself, and we'll make sure she gets the information as well. Thank you guys for being here. We appreciate all of you.
Yes.
Bye, guys.
And stay tuned for the documentary. It should come out on Netflix at some point.
Tell them the name of it again, Janet.
Well, it's Breaking Down, Breaking Open, or Breaking Through. And we are also looking to do a movie where we bring all the legal issues on. And it's called Calling God to the Witness Stand. We want to bring truth to the witness stand for psychiatric rights. So we'll, yeah, find me on LinkedIn or Facebook because we announce all our next steps there. So
Wonderful.
excellent.
Thank you, Janet. Bye, guys.